Hi guys, and welcome to the first video in a mini-series where I'll be exploring the Final Fantasy VII compilation lore and Easter eggs that appear in episode Intermission. I'm MJ Gallagher, author of books such as Norse myths that inspired Final Fantasy VII and The Nibelheim Incident, an award-winning project produced in association with KupoCon. Like my main series breaking down the chapters of Final Fantasy VII Remake, all of which can be found on KupoCon's YouTube channel, the purpose of these videos is to highlight a lot of the detail hidden within Intermission, and to provide a broader understanding for new and veteran fans alike. In this episode, I'll be examining Chapter 1 of the DLC, itself titled Wutai's Finest. Just as a forewarning, the video will be spoiler heavy for this part of Intermission, Remake in general, and the wider compilation of Final Fantasy VII. And if you're new to my channel, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Before we get into the meat of the chapter, I just wanted to touch on the title screen for Intermission. Having the 4-point shuriken of Yuffie Kisaragi, the DLC's protagonist, embedded in the ground like this, obviously parallels Cloud's Buster Sword in the main title screen, which in turn is a callback to the original Final Fantasy VII's title. The shuriken, however, is planted in metal flooring, which is a likely allusion to the factories and facilities Yuffie will visit during Intermission. Also note that there is no materia equipped, just like with the Buster Sword. The chapter begins by revealing Yuffie in her Moogle cape disguise, humming softly to herself. The tune is in fact descendant of Shinobi, which is the girl's theme music from the old game. Meanwhile, the disguise itself is similar to the one she wore in Dirge of Cerberus, but it's been adapted to match the remake's Moogle design. Yuffie begins to scan the cityscape of Midgar through her scope, and there are some interesting symbols on the lens's interior, which I'll come back to shortly. She is subsequently accosted by a flock of pigeons, causing her to lose her footing. This is a callback to two things. The first is Aerith falling from a rooftop in Chapter 8 of Remake, also because of some pigeons, while the second is a running compilation gag. Despite her agility as a ninja, Yuffie seems to have a problem with balance, and has several instances across Before Crisis, Advent Children and Dirge of Cerberus where she takes a comedic tumble. As a side note, the balance issue may also relate to why she suffers from motion sickness. Speaking of sickness, when Yuffie emerges from the derelict building, she has to stop herself from vomiting. It's implied this is because of the area's stench, which she also references later in the chapter, but it may be because of the fall itself. The latter would be a nod to Advent Children, when Yuffie does the same thing after arriving in Edge by parachute. In terms of her falling down this way, there is one particular instance in the compilation that has striking visual and contextual similarities. It occurs in Dirge of Cerberus, when Yuffie stops Nero the Sable from attacking Vincent Valentine in the ruined forecourt of Mako Reactor Zero. At the time, she is dressed in her Moogle cape, announces herself with her characteristic flair, then loses her footing and plummets from a high height, all of which we also see here. The contextual importance of this is that it's been no secret since Intermission's reveal trailer that Deepground and its super soldiers were going to feature to some extent. Until now, they have been almost exclusive to Dirge of Cerberus. As it happens, there are a huge amount of parallels between Intermission and the latter half of that game, and I'll point these out as we go. The most obvious is probably that Yuffie and Vincent, the lead protagonist in Dirge of Cerberus, were both optional characters in Final Fantasy VII, but are now the only two of the original playable cast to have their own spin-off games. Perhaps another is that Yuffie arrives in the outskirts of the Sector 7 slums, just as Vincent arrives in Midgar during the battle with Deepground at the train graveyard. The disused railway tracks dotted around here might be a small allusion to that, as might the brief cinematic shot of Yuffie with the city's central pillar in the background. Yuffie announces herself to the Avalanche operative she hopes is nearby, establishing she is a materia hunter working for the elite special forces of the new Wutai government. She says she has orders to infiltrate Shinra headquarters and steal their ultimate materia. There's actually quite a bit to deconstruct from all this. In the original Final Fantasy VII, Yuffie is an optional character who identifies as a materia hunter, and a large part of her story arc, the specifics of which are also optional, relate to her trying to steal the party's materia. She intends to restore glory to Wutai, a nation whose power was decimated when they lost their war with the Shinra Company, a conflict which started shortly after Yuffie was born and ended 7 years ago. In the old game, Yuffie is never affiliated with Wutai's military, so being a special forces operative is new to Intergrade. Furthermore, it is never indicated in Final Fantasy VII that Wutai has a structure of government, with the five mighty gods implied to be a form of authority. Incidentally, the leader of that group is Yuffie's father, Godo Kisaragi. The closest the wider compilation ever comes to addressing the subject is in Crisis Core, where a hierarchy of military command is established via the Rogue Crescent unit. Therefore, introducing Yuffie as acting in an official capacity under the orders of the Wutai government adds a drastically different dimension to the story. But if anyone was going to be a perfect fit for a mission to steal a powerful materia and return it to Wutai, it would be Yuffie. As for the girl's relationship with Avalanche, I'll provide an explanation for that in the next video. For now though, what I will highlight is that the Avalanche liaison's use of Moogle posters as a way of guiding Yuffie through the area is pretty consistent with the organisation's use of stamp graffiti in the passages around Midgar. Cloud, Barrett and Tifa following the Beagle artwork in the railway tunnels during Remake's Chapter 5 is probably the best example of this. And before we move on, I couldn't not mention the stray cat hanging around the site where Yuffie lands. Remake itself contains an excessive amount of felines, especially in Sector 7, with the material Ultimania including illustrations for all the different breeds that can be found. We may or may not also see this exact cat later. Just as a little bit of rare trivia for fans, it's also worth noting Yuffie's starting level in Intermission. I personally don't think it's a coincidence she is at level 25 when she enters Midgar, because this is exactly half of 50, the level cap for the other characters in Remake. In the original Final Fantasy VII, Yuffie's stats when she's recruited by the player is loosely dependent on the average level of the rest of the group. This mechanic, in turn, was developed from an earlier concept where she was a bounty hunter, and the player would find wanted posters around the towns. Her age, appearance and level was intended to change from poster to poster, and Yuffie's look and stats when you challenged her would be based on the last poster you read. A short distance into the underdeveloped land on the slum outskirts, Yuffie encounters a few small monsters. This is the player's first real opportunity to test out her ninja fighting style. In addition to standard melee attacks with her shuriken, Yuffie uses ninjutsu, which is typically said to be a less conventional form of Japanese martial arts, often associated with stealth and guerrilla warfare. However, ninjutsu is perhaps better described in general as a collection of survival techniques including disguise, misdirection, avoidance, and even free running. But I'll come back to this side of things in a later video. The Final Fantasy series employs quite a particular adaptation of ninjutsu, historically defined in the games as ninja magic. In the Final Fantasy VII universe, ninjutsu is separate to spells cast through materia, so Yuffie's use of it is arguably closer in nature to Aerith's intrinsic abilities. Bright magical symbols appear around Yuffie when she uses ninjutsu, for both elemental and non-elemental attacks. If you look closely, you might see that some of the characters are the same as those on the scope lens I mentioned earlier. Interestingly, these symbols relate to a fictional language, presumably Wutaian in origin, but it's unclear if they are specific to ninjutsu or not, effectively working like runic charms. As was pointed out by Audrey on Twitter, the characters on the scope's lens seem to function like a Chinese magnetic compass. Make of that what you will. In terms of Yuffie's battle functions, her short-range melee strikes are not too dissimilar to some of her limit breaks in the old game, while her long-range shuriken throws and ninja magic are perhaps more like her previous standard attacks. One exception to this is that when her shuriken is embedded in the side of an opponent, she can unleash a powerful ninjutsu assault, where a blast of magic rips through the ground towards her foe. This resembles her Landscaper limit break from Final Fantasy VII. As for Yuffie's actual limit break in Intermission, Bloodbath is just an elaborate version of the old Bloodfest. At the end of the battle, Yuffie will do a jaunty little jump and spin on one leg, just as she does in the original. And, if you're really lucky, you'll get to hear her hum the victory fanfare, just as Barrett does in Remake. Conversely, if you are bested by an enemy, Yuffie will sink to her knees and speak one of a few preset lines. Among these is "Winter comes and Wutai's white rose withers away." This is a reference to herself, because she uses the epithet of the single white rose of Wutai during Dirge of Cerberus. It's not long before Yuffie locates her first materia in the field, prompting the player to consider what orbs she has equipped. As it happens, she starts with quite a few. Of these, perhaps the steel materia is the best Easter egg, as it's a likely allusion to her being a materia thief in the original game. She previously joined the party equipped with throw materia, which might explain why that's the command for her long-range shuriken attack. And while we're on the subject of equipment, Yuffie obviously starts the DLC with her trademark 4-point shuriken, just as she does in the original. The weapon's info screen states it is an oversized throwing star used by ninja from Wutai, implying it is commonly used by others in the Wutaian Special Forces. This corroborates a line in the Yuffie episode of the official novel On the Way to a Smile, where she mentions that shurikens are traditional weapons of Wutai, and she has trained with one since her youth. Anyone who pre-ordered a copy of Intergrade will have been granted access to Yuffie's Kakstar weapon. This throwing star can also be purchased as a standalone item for those of us who were ineligible to pre-order, and likely alludes to the Cactuar summon materia originally being a downloadable extra as part of the deluxe edition of Remake. While official gameplay footage showcased in the days before Intergrade's release did confirm the presence of the black-robed figures in the DLC, the first surprise comes in the abandoned warehouse, when Yuffie initially encounters such an individual. For a quick bit of context, in the original game, the people in the cloaks are described as Sephiroth clones. This is simply the term used by Professor Hojo to identify those who have gone through similar cellular experimentation to Sephiroth, but in their case, overexposure to Mako has led to incapacitating effects. The Genova cells also present in their bodies give the black-robed men and women an instinctual drive to gather at the reunion, basically the reunification of Genova. This is why they typically groan reunion or Genova as you pass, and specifically why this man raised his head towards the height of Midgar's central pillar. He's not drawn to the pillar as such, but rather the building that sits atop it, for Shinra headquarters is where the Genova specimen is currently located. Anyway, each of the cloaked figures are tattooed with a different number, and no more than 18 of them are ever found in the old Final Fantasy VII. 2 of them show up in Remake, with the named character Marco bearing the number 49 on his arm, indicating the volume of Sephiroth clones is substantially higher than we previously thought. 3 more are present in the Sector 7 outskirts during the early part of episode Intermission. Number 11 is here in the warehouse, number 20 is being attacked by wolves, and number 16 lurks near the trail to Scrap Boulevard. What many fans may not be aware of is that an explanation for who these Midgar-based clones actually are features as part of the official short story Picturing the Past, contained in the World Preview book and authored by Final Fantasy VII lead scenario writer Kazushige Najima. In summary, they are men and women who joined a special investigation unit of Shinra 15 years ago to search for Mako hotspots around the planet, based on visionary pictures drawn by a young Aerith. Many suffered extreme Mako poisoning and were later experimented on by Professor Hojo and his colleagues. Dozens of clones now dwell around the city, and they often congregate at random locations. One such gathering in the story occurs at the train graveyard, which is not too far from Yuffie's present position. Incidentally, if you return here later in the chapter, all the clones have vanished. What's especially peculiar about this observation is that a figure with a number 11 tattoo also appears at Tifa's house when the party initially visits the rebuilt Nibelheim in the old game. On a totally unrelated subject, you may have noticed Yuffie doing star jumps if the player leaves her stationary for a while. This is yet another characteristic of hers that has been lifted from Dirge of Cerberus. And finally, to conclude the first part of this video series, I'd like to touch on the enemy types encountered in Intermission. The DLC has provided a solid mix of recurring opponents from Remake and entirely new fiends. A couple of these are of particular interest, and the wayward wolves circling clone number 20 are the first to be engaged. The enemy intel screen for these ferocious canines states that they used to stalk the plains outside Midgar, but have made their way into the city. This is a reference to the Calm Fang enemies that can be fought on the overworld map in the original game as soon as the party leaves Midgar. The old Calm Fangs were actually purple in colour, and this is reflected in the concept illustrations for the Wayward Wolves in the art book that accompanies the deluxe edition of Intergrade. The brown furred variant that appears in Intermission itself was previously used on the Nibel Wolves in Final Fantasy VII and was simply a palette swap for the battle model of the Calm Fang. Similarly, the Leprechaun mini-boss that the player faces off later in Chapter 1 is a monster that roams the grasslands area of the overworld map in the original game. Both Wayward Wolves and Leprechauns are very likely to feature in the next remake instalment. Well folks, this has been my recap of the compilation lore and Easter eggs from the Sector 7 outskirts area of episode Intermission. I hope you've enjoyed it, and please be sure to leave a comment with any feedback or something you think I've missed. If you haven't already done so, I invite you to check out my main Final Fantasy VII Remake video series, where I extensively break down the lore and Easter eggs chapter by chapter. Those episodes are funded by Coupacon and hosted on their YouTube channel. I'll leave a link to the full playlist in the description below. If you like these videos, remember to subscribe to both channels and turn on your notifications. And please consider picking up a copy of my book, Norse Myths That Inspired Final Fantasy VII, which is now also available as a special edition hardback. The links to each edition can be found on my Patreon account, in addition to all my other projects, and I've noted this in the description as well. But until next time, take care. I'm MJ Gallagher, and I'll speak to you again soon in part 2.